This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. I'm speaking with Bret Witter. He is a writer and reporter who has written many books on true life incidents and people, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Bret Witter is my guest. He is a writer. He has a website, bretwitter.com. He's written numbers of books, mostly nonfiction, about World War II, about pets, about a lot of other things, and we'll be talking with him about some of those books. Bret, welcome, and if you could give a little bit of background, a few minutes bio about yourself, how you got into writing, reporting, and so forth.
Sure. I came up in the book business. I haven't actually been a reporter for a newspaper, magazine, anything like that. I'm from Alabama. Moved to New York City when I was 22 after college, and ended up as an assistant at Avon Publishing. Worked my way up to editor. Was in the editorial field until I was 36. Decided to start writing my own books as a ghostwriter. I did it that way. A ghostwriter is essentially someone who partners with a person to tell their nonfiction story. I did it that way because I was 36. I had one kid already. My wife was pregnant, so I knew this was a way that I could make my dream a reality, which was to make money writing books and not have to go into an office and spend the rest of, hopefully, my working life writing. So that's what I've been doing since 2007, and it's been the best job I've ever had.
Well, you said that you're a ghostwriter. So do you consider yourself more or less doing reportage when you collaborate with people? Because most of the stories are based on nonfiction. You didn't grow up then wanting to be Charles Dickens then?
Oh, sure. I grew up and wanted to be Faulkner.
Yeah.
But, that's not particularly realistic. At least in my case. So what I do is, I was in the book business for a long time, so I had a good friend who was an agent, and I was like, look, if you have any people you think have a good story but can't write it, just let me know, and I would love to partner with them. So what I do is, I feel like it's reporting, but it's reporting from one person's perspective. Mm-hmm. So my first book was Dewey. As you've read it. It's a book about a cat that lived in a library in a small town in Iowa. What I really did was talk to the woman I worked with, Vicki Myron. I spent 10 days with her, talking with her every day, 3 or 4 hours a day. I'd probably do 1 or 2 hours a day with other people in the town, sort of ancillary reporting, but really what I was doing was telling her story from her perspective. That's what I do. I tell one person's story from their perspective, and I try to dig downward, deeper into their perspective, as opposed to outward, like many reporters do. I don't feel like I need to get 30 people's perspective. Let me get one person and dig deep, deep, deep down into what they feel, what they experienced, and why.
So I'll get back to the Dewey book, which is the reason I contacted you. I'd also read Monuments Men a few years ago, and that's probably your most well-known work, I guess, since it was made into a big movie. But you talked about ghostwriting and collaborating. So are these projects basically make-work projects that are handed to you, or do you, for example, in Monuments Men, was your father in World War II and he heard this story and you said, God, I got to research this? How do they work? Are they all different?
No, I have an agent. He proposes. He gets in touch with these people. Obviously, he's an agent. He gets in touch with hundreds of people. When he feels like he has someone who might be a good match for me, he calls me, asks me if I'm interested. When we first started out, I was turning down 95% of the books. He knows me very well now, so he knows the projects I'm going to be interested in. But what I would do, like for the Monuments Men, he told me, hey, this guy's been doing Robert Edsel. He's done 15 years of research on this group of Monuments Men. During World War II, they were art experts, and they went and they saved all this artwork. And I said, well, that's a story I've never heard before. It sounds extraordinary. Let me get on the phone with Robert and talk about it. So I got on the phone with Robert, and the problem was that he wasn't a writer. He didn't know how to turn it into a book. We probably started off with a 3 or 4 hour conversation. And what I want to see out of that conversation is, one, do I like this person? Do I want to spend a year of my life with them? Yes, I liked Robert. And then two, not only is this a good story, is it a story that I have a clear idea about how it can be turned into a book?
Mm.
Like when I find that, do I take this story? Can I feel like, oh, I understand the different strains here. I understand how to turn this into a story that people are going to care about. That's what I look for. I look for a great person and a great story that I understand how to write.
I also see it looks like you've also ghosted on some novels, A Shadow War. Is that correct too?
I did do 2 novels.
So what's the difference between ghostwriting and collaborating on fiction versus nonfiction? I mean, other than the obvious fact that one is totally made up and the other is based upon reality.
It was so different. Collaborating on fiction is basically impossible, I realized. It was very tough. What'll happen when I'm working on a book is I'll write a first draft. I'll write the whole first draft and give it to the person. And then we'll go over it. We'll start talking about it, and we'll see the areas of agreement or disagreement. And the good thing is with nonfiction, we can always go back to the facts. If they feel like I've misinterpreted something, I can ask them, well, tell me more. Let's talk about it. Why do you feel that way? We always can go back to the facts. I realized with fiction, there was never any facts to go back to. So the more we dug, Sean and I love Sean, and we had a great time working on the book. But I just realized it was so easy for us to come at cross purposes because there was no grounding for the book. That in the end, we worked quite a bit at cross purposes to each other accidentally. It was an amazing sort of learning experience for me.
Well, let me just ask a couple of questions for people who are younger people who may be like you, who are looking to get writing but may not necessarily want to be fiction writers. When we talk about a ghostwriter, I mean, in traditional publishing, if someone writes a novel or if they write their memoir, if they're famous, usually they'll get 15% of whatever the publishing house is going to sell, plus what goes to the agent. What is the relationship with a ghostwriter? Do you split it 50-50 with the person who's credited, like Vicky Myron in the Dewey book, or do you get a percentage of what they get?
I'd rather not discuss particular percentages,
Yeah.
but I am paid a percentage. I'm not paid upfront. I don't have any set fee.
Mm-hmm.
I am paid a percentage of whatever the project makes.
And is that also for descendant projects like Monuments Men when they turned it into a movie? Did you write the screenplay for the movie, or did you help on the screenplay?
I was not. No, I did not write the screenplay. I wasn't involved in sort of the movie at all. Robert and I really weren't involved in it, and that's just typical. I mean, you don't really get any say with Hollywood, especially Monuments Men was interesting because they called up and they said, "Well, George Clooney wants to turn your book into a movie." And Robert started to say, well, what about this and this? And they were just like, whoa, hold on right there. George Clooney wants to turn your book into a movie. We're offering you X amount of money, and that's it. And, of course, Robert took the deal, but we didn't have a lot of say in the movie. But I did participate financially.
So when you do books like that, you're basically a writer for hire. You're not, you would be hired to craft. You're sort of like...
I am hired by the expert like Robert or Vicky. My contract is with them. They hire me and they are my boss.
Okay. So let me talk about some of the other books before I focus on the 2 main books that I have read, Dewey and Monuments Men. We just talked about Shadow War, and I'm looking to have Stronger. Was that you co-wrote that? What was that book about?
Well, that was with Jeff Bowman, who lost both his legs in the Boston Marathon bombing. He was actually the person who was standing right next to the bomber, and right before the bomb went off, noticed the bag. So he was pretty much in a coma for 3 days, but when he woke up, he's the one that sort of gave the police the tips to identify the bomber. So that book is really, it's about the bombing, but it's mostly about the next year of his life, his recovery. And that's actually being turned into a movie too. So it's been filmed. Jake Gyllenhaal's playing him. So should be out in fall 2017.
And then you did a book called Santa is Real. What was that about? That you
that was just a fun book. I feel like a lot of my books they discuss very serious topics, and a lot of the people I work with have had terrible things happen to them, like Jeff losing his legs, or Luis Montalban, who was a Iraq veteran with PTSD. Santa's Real is just a fun book I wrote with the guy who plays Santa Claus on the Radio City music hall. He's been doing that for 30 years. We sort of did a fictionalized version of what it's like to be Santa Claus in the Radio City music hall. It's a fun book. It's my dad's favorite, so...
And then there's another book, Until I Say Goodbye, My Year of Living with Joy. What was that about?
I worked with Susan Spencer-Wendel, who is honestly probably my favorite person I've ever worked with. Wonderful, wonderful woman. 45-year-old mother of 3 who had Lou Gehrig's disease, which, as most people know, it's an incurable, unstoppable disease. Where your muscles slowly break down. She realized she only had 1 year of life left, and she wanted to take a special trip. She chose the 7 most important people in her life and took a special trip with each one of them. So that's a book about that year.
And then there's a book. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I just think, in dealing with serious illness and death, and the sadness and the joy that last year can bring.
And then there's a book that I see, a golden voice, Ted Williams. That wasn't the baseball player, was it?
No, that was Ted Williams was a homeless guy who had a sort of, was rescued because he was in this video, and he has this incredible voice. He was doing this like panhandling, and he had this incredible voice. So he rescued. It's really a book about homelessness.
Okay.
And so it's serious topics, obviously. Yeah. It's very often serious topics.
Yeah, but it does look like you did another book about a dog. Tuesday Takes Me There, I guess, as a bookend for the Dewey book. And what was that dog's tale?
Well, Until Tuesday, this is also one of my favorite books. Luis Montalban, the guy I worked with, was a Iraq veteran. He had PTSD. He was stuck in his apartment for 2 years, unable to go outside, or unable or unwilling to go outside, and he ended up getting a trained service dog, a dog that helps people with disabilities, and that dog, his name was Tuesday, transformed his life. And so that's a book about it's PTSD as seen through this relationship between a veteran and his dog. That book, I often, when I choose somebody to work with, I feel like they have a lot of media contacts, they can get out there, they can do something. Luis was very different. I mean, here's a guy who had been out of his apartment for a couple of years, was just coming out of it. I thought, this book probably won't work, but it's a really important story to understand about PTSD, particularly among veterans, and how service dogs can help. The book did great, ended up being a bestseller and selling 300,000 copies, and really, really touching a lot of lives. So it's one I'm very proud of.
I also see a book you have listed called "The Grits: Girls Raised in the South: Guide to Life." Is that a cookbook or?
That was my first book. So that's actually how I stumbled into being a writer. I had been an editor for a long time, and I was trying to get out of it. I became an agent and sold a book. I'm from Alabama, so I saw a T-shirt when I was back home visiting my parents, and it said "Grits" on it, and I was like, "What's that?" My parents were like, "That's Grits means girls raised in the South. Don't you know that?" And I was like, "I did not know that, but I think that could be a book." So I contacted the woman who made the T-shirts, and she was, we got a book deal out of it, sort of like different things about being a woman in the South, sort of a fun book, sort of list and short chapters and things like that. And then she ended up not writing the book, and it was due in 4 days. So I was like, I'm going to step in and write this book for you, and I did. And so we ended up collaborating on it, and after that, that editor asked me to write another book, and you know, a couple of years after that, I ended up going full time.
Well, before we talk about the two main books that I had read, I see that you also did some other books about Tuesday the dog and Dewey the cat, children's versions of the books. Was that initially a part of the plan, or did those books do so well that just like in Hollywood they want to do a sequel, but you know, how is each Dewey or Tuesday book different from the original?
Yeah, they you know, after the adult books did very well, the publishers actually asked us, you know, they came with us with the idea of doing children's books. So it was great. I think both those stories, because they have animals, and kids love animals, so it's very easy to get them into a book in which the main character, one's a cat, one's a dog. So we did some children's books. I'm not a children's book writer, but I'm proud of both those books. I think they came out very well, and they were quite fun experiences.
Well, I see, like, for example, Dewey has a Christmas book, and then another book. So were they like tales that were expanded from the original book, or were they tales that had been excluded?
They were mentioned in the original book, but we went in and we pulled them out as single stories, and you know, change of perspective a little. I mean, in the case of the Tuesday book, Tuesday is the narrator of the children's book. The dog himself is the narrator. It's not quite like that in the Dewey book, but it's very much more from the animal's perspective, which I think is just sort of nice for kids and really fun for us to get into that, you know, as writers, to get sort of into that mindset.
Well, before I go back to Monuments Men and Dewey, let me just ask, so now that you've done, you know, about a dozen books total in terms of co-writing, do you have projects yourself that you're interested in? Like if there was some historical work you want to do? I mean, do you aspire to be someone like Laura Hillenbrand that can look at some historical event and say, God, I want to write about that person or that event?
I don't. I thought when I went into this job that I would, if I did. I told myself if I'm successful, then I'll do my own book. Well, I've been 100 times more successful than I ever thought I would be. But it turns out that I love this work. I just love it. I love doing it this way. I just love being able to sit down with one person. I've really become a fan of the contemporary stuff. People who are alive, we're talking about things in the world going on right now. I really love sitting down and digging deep with them. You know, in theory, I could just do it myself. I could just say, hey, you know, call someone up and say, I'm not a famous writer, but I'm a very successful writer, and why don't you let me write your story? And but it just doesn't. I don't like that idea. I think they should be paid. I like the fact that we get to split the money and they get paid, and I like the fact that they're the ones out there that get to go out and do the publicity and tell their stories. I think it's just great. I just love to do the writing. You know, I'm not a fan of going out there and doing the marketing and bugging everybody to buy my books. So this, for me, is perfect. This is what I want to do.
So is your ideal situation coming across someone with a story and they have an idea of how to tell it, or do you prefer that they just have an interesting story and you prefer coming in and telling them how to shape it best?
I come in and tell them how to shape it. I mean, my opinion is you've lived an interesting life, or in the case of like Robert, you've found an interesting story, but I'm the writer and I know how to turn it into a book. I know how to structure it, and I know how to position it to make people, you know, to make people care, and I know how to turn it into a story that's going to be compelling. So I think we never specifically talk like that, the people I collaborate with, but I think that's understood that, you know, I'm not coming in and you're not going to tell me to book to write. That's a vanity project. You know, we're going to partner and we're going to sell it to a publisher, and our goal is to write a best-selling book. And I'm an expert on that, so so they trust me.
So do you usually go in with, say, a formula? Is there a way that you say, well, if I can hit 1, 2, 3 particular high points in a book, let's say about the animal books or something, that usually that's going to get a certain kind of a reader that maybe might see the book at the end of a Barnes and Noble aisle and pick it up?
Well, usually what I do, so we have what we'll do is we'll talk on the phone. Like before we even sign up, we'll talk on the phone for a couple hours. It's usually one call, but maybe it'll be a couple calls. I want them to be comfortable with me. I mean, I'm sure they can go back to some people have gone back to my agent who sets those calls up and says, I don't really like that guy. I don't want to work with him. I've gone back to my agent certainly and been like, look, it's a good story, but I don't think we're going to get along that well. But what we do in that 2 or 3 that hour is I'm always thinking like, okay, and asking questions and finding out things, and I start to see. Well, it's different with every book, but like with Dewey, it was that I saw that there were 3 important strands I thought I could weave together in that book. A story about a cat, a story about a woman in her 60s from that generation and what she had to go through to find her place in the world, and the story about what's been going on in small towns in America since the 1980s. I thought, well, those 3 strands can make not just an interesting book and not just a sellable book, but a book that says something important about the world. With the Monuments Men, it was a little bit different. I mean, Robert and I talked for a while, and I realized there had been 6 books out on the Monuments Men already, none of which had sold very well. And a lot of that was because about 90% of the Monuments Men story is boring. It's just like paperwork and finding things and like transporting them. And so when I sat down with Robert, we were talking, and it was like, well, take me through sort of in order, and we got to the point where he told this incredible story that's at the end of the book about this salt mine in Austria. And right then I was like, wait, back up. I think that's the end. Like, let's stop there. I think that's where the book ends, and let's go back and construct the story of how we get to that point. And he was like, well, there's like tons more stuff. There's 20 more years. And I was like, Robert, I don't think we're going to need to put that in the book. I think that's the 90% that's boring, that's everybody's trying to cover. Why instead of trying to make this entire thing interesting, why don't we just take the most interesting part? If we do this 10% of the story, people are going to understand what happened. They're going to understand the magnitude of what happened. And Robert was like, yeah, it sounds great. So that's sort of the moment I think that we decided that we knew this book was going to work. Like, we thought, well, we've got a plan now. We understand how we're going to sell this to a publisher and how we're going to sell this. And Robert wanted, his goal was to have 1 million people know who the Monuments Men were. And that,
Well, let me talk about the idea of memoir. Let me start with Monuments Men, and then we'll work our way back to Dewey. With something like the Monuments Men, there would seem to be a greater need for fidelity to facts. A lot of times you'll find in memoirs, people have misrepresented things, made up things. People, who claim to have been some victim of something, it turned out that they weren't. So when you're doing a historical thing, especially about World War II, which is quite well documented, to what degree, I mean, when you got the story from Robert about his experience, do you go fact check, or is there an independent fact checker that goes and say, oh, yes, he was in this troop, he was stationed, so forth, because that could come back to bite you in the ass if it's not correct?
Well, in the case of Robert, he had actually done 15 years of research on this subject, and his research had actually involved going and getting first-hand sources, which meant like, first of all, interviews with Monuments Men who were alive, but also he'd go to the children of Monuments Men and say, I'm going to interview you, but also, do you have any letters? Do you have any, a lot of it was letters. Do you have any journals that it was mostly men, so that your father kept? So he had, I laugh still thinking of when he sent me this material. I got this giant box, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like a giant box of first-hand material to go through. And then that was like the first of like 10 boxes, it turned out. I mean, I had things stacked up so high. But I didn't myself have to go through all those and find the material. What I did is I had it there, and I was like, Robert, like, let's talk about what's in this box. And like, he'd say, oh, and this, and then he would pinpoint me to things that I should focus on. So I see he had gone through and read 1,000 pages and then told me that, like,
yeah. So you were
basically most important.
He was basically the conduit of the information, and you shaped what he filtered out then.
Yes, and Robert was very, very thorough. Like, we had a book that which one of the guys wrote it? Jim Rormer had written a book about his experience in World War II. But then Robert thought, well, he wrote this book, the publisher rejected it, he had a writer come in and rewrite it for him. So some of the things might have changed. So what Robert did was actually went back and found the first draft of that book from Jim Rormer's Children, the one that Jim had written himself, which was not particularly good and quite boring, but was much more factually accurate than the book that originally came out. So he went all the way back to the source. He hired someone who spoke German to translate German documents to do it because he had some documents that hadn't been translated. He was extremely thorough about the research in the book, and actually the publisher dissuaded him from putting in all his notes at the end of the book. They thought the book was kind of getting fat, and they didn't want it to, another 80 pages of notes, so he put it on his website. But he had like a tremendous amount. He did a tremendous amount of research.
Now, that's a big story, and it's sort of antithetical or oppositional to something like Dewey or the book on the dog. Do each of those present, I would assume, different challenges? And in the future, are you drawn more to these smaller books about individual people or animals, or do you want to do, for example, another big sort of sprawling book about, a big topic?
I would say that Dewey and the Monuments Men are exactly opposite. I have shorthand described them sometimes as Dewey is taking a molehill and making it into a mountain, whereas the Monuments Men was taking a mountain and turning it back down into a molehill so that you could sort of grasp it all. So they're exactly the opposite. You're correct about that. I personally gravitate more towards a Dewey type story. Yeah. That's a lot of my personal philosophy. If there was another Monuments Men story that came to me, yes, I would love to do it. That was a fantastic experience and a great story. But sort of I think my personal talents and my interests are more in digging into ordinary lives. I think what distinguishes the books I write is that I'm not really a fan of working with wealthy or famous people. What I really am interested in doing is working with ordinary people. I kind of ordinary with a little bit extra, and because those are the lives that are really going to matter to readers. Those are lives that readers can really see themselves in. Vicki Myron, her family farm went bankrupt, and she didn't get to go to college because she was a woman, and her parents couldn't afford it. They sent her brother instead. And she had to work in a box factory to put him through college, and she was married to an alcoholic, but she found her place. She didn't come out of that and make $100 million. She came out of that and she was a librarian, and she loved it. Well, and I think that's an incredible story, because most of us are going to find our happiness sort of in that perfect job, being not ordinary people, but just happy people. That's what I want to write. And that's, I think, part of what made the Monuments work. When other stories about the Monuments Men didn't work is because other stories took a very top-down approach. It was like, oh, what did FDR do? What did Eisenhower do? What did the guys who run museums in the United States do? We took the exact opposite approach, which is like, what did the guys in the bottom do? what did the guys who are actually out in the field do? And who were those guys were the heroes, And so I think that's why it worked, that we went for the ordinary people whose stories usually don't get told. We told them.
Yeah, so I want to talk now about the Dewey book, which my wife had bought a few years ago. I read a few months ago. You said this was your first book that you had co-written, and So, what was it about? You just said a little bit about the woman Vicky. Was it more her story or more the cat story and how he became famous on the internet that drew you?
Well, um, it was their relationship. I think all books are about a relationship. Um, but it's a little bit of a more complicated question than you might think. Um, what happened was, here's the full story. I think it's very interesting. I was quitting. I decided to quit my job. Called my agent. It was like, I've been talking with my wife for 2 years now. She finally let me quit my job, and I have 6 months to see if I can make this work. Um, and he's like, and I'm like, do you have a project? You know, I need one right away. And he's like, well, yeah, that's great because I just talked to a woman who's a librarian in a small town in Iowa, and their library cat just died. And she'd love to write a book about it. And I was like, man, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. That is just horrible. Come on, a cat that just died in Iowa. I mean, but he said his argument was, look, this is cats and libraries. There's a market for that. And I said, still not interested. And he's like, well, why don't you talk to Vicky? So when I talked with Vicky, that's when I realized a lot. That's when I realized it was a book because one, I realized I loved her personal story. She always wanted to talk about Dewey, but then I'd say, well, what about you, Vicky? What about this? And she'd always say, oh, my life's not very interesting, or I'm not, I did this. Then all these things started coming out that were incredible to me, like all the things she'd gone through, breast cancer and an alcoholic husband, like I said, and her family falling into poverty and not being able to go to college, and all these things. And I remember at one point, I said to her, wow, Vicky, you've led a hard life. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, I listed those things. It's hard. She's like, no, I've led a great life. It's like, I have a job I love. I live in a town I love. I have a great family. I have great friends. And I have Dewey. And as soon as she said that, I thought, well, that's the book right there. That's a book. You know? And right after that, I just called Peter up, my agent, and was like, yeah, I think, I still don't think we can sell this thing. But I want to try. I like this message. I like this woman. I like this cat. I like her and the cat together. Let's do it. And of course, we ended up getting a phenomenal deal, and it was a life-changing experience for me and Vicky.
So, how many incidents, for example, that you were told of regarding the cat or regarding Vicky, and what percentage of them made it into the book? Was it like 10% of the things that were told to you, or 20, or 30?
I think every single thing told to me about Dewey was put into the book. Yeah. It is a book about a cat. It's an entire book length, 75,000 word book about a cat. And I love Dewey, but cats don't do all that much.
Yeah.
The cat that only left the library one time, they don't do all that much. So every single Dewey story that I heard, I don't know, maybe there's some that didn't make it, but essentially everything I heard about Dewey made it into the book. Now the rest of the story about Vicky and her life and about the town of Spencer and sort of about Iowa, and because it's very much a book about place, very much a book about place. So that all that had to be staged. Obviously, there's endless things you can write about a town or a state or agriculture, or even one person's life, like Vicky's. I mean, she did a lot more complicated things than Dewey, but all that had to be staged. But in terms of what the Dewey story, I got in as much cat as I possibly could into the book.
Yeah, I know you go into the background of some of the political and economic stuff that went on in the town, the history of the founding of the town, I believe, and whatnot. Now, there's sort of like a cottage industry, at least I guess maybe since this century started, of books about animals, and a number of authors themselves have written of. I interviewed a woman, Cy Montgomery, who's a naturalist, who did a book called The Good, Good Pig, and there was books about, numbers of books about dogs. A fellow named John Katz wrote one called The Good Dog. When were you aware of these types of books when you were writing Dewey? Because I think a few of them came out after, but I think there were a few books before Dewey came out. Did any of those act as a guide? Did you read and say, "Oh, this book about this dog took this twist. Let me see if there's anything similar in the tales about Dewey"?
I mean, I'm very close to the book business. I'm not just a writer, I consider this my business, so I do study the book business. So obviously, the big boom you're talking about was kicked off by one book, Marley and Me.
Yeah.
And so I was, of course, aware of Marley and Me. When we sold Dewey, there had been a number of follow-up dog books. But there was not a, like, Marley and Me for cats.
Yeah.
This is not for lack of trying. I was an editor for a long time, so, every editor turns down 100 cat books a year. I mean, people always try to get cat books published. And most of the time, they're very hard to sell. They're very hard to sell. So I was aware of Marley and Me, and I knew there was an opening for a book about cats. But I did read Marley and Me, but I didn't read it with the idea of I'm going to try to bite this formula, or I'm going to do this or that. Actually, the tone and style of Dewey really came about as I was writing it. I mean, honestly, I thought I was, I'm too cool to write a cat book. I can't take a cat book seriously. But then when I started writing it, I thought, well, yeah, why can't I take this book seriously? And my goal, it sounds simplistic, but I wanted people to cry when they read the Dewey book. I wanted the people to be emotionally invested in Vicky and Dewey in this town and really be rooting for them. And that's all that I really focused on. It was like, don't just get on the facts, get to the emotions of the story,
Yeah.
If something was inspiring to the people in the town, then it should be inspiring to the readers. If something was sad and made people who knew Dewey cry, then hopefully the readers should cry. That real emotion that those people felt, particularly Vicky, but other people too, those real emotions should be felt by the reader. And if you can do that, then you have a good book.
Yeah, I know that I think fiction generally is an abysmal state this century, and I know one of the reasons that I've read a number of animal books is because if you're feeling kind of blue, you can read a sort of lighthearted book about a cat or a dog or a pig or even a parrot maybe, and find something uplifting. You mentioned that there's about 100 proposals for cat books. So obviously there's going to be different stories for these different animals, but I would assume that the thing that made the Dewey story stick out for you was the Vicky thing. Is that an element that's missing, do you think, in most animal books? Because you mentioned Marley and Me. I saw a book once, Finding Atticus, about a guy who goes hiking on mountains with his little dog and whatnot. And so is there some kind of thing that you think separates the good or the best-selling animal books from maybe books that have good stories, but they just don't excite either the public if they're published or an editor if they're not?
I mean, a lot of it has to do with the writing. Honestly, it has to capture. I think that's too. Some of them are not well written. Some of them are incorrectly written. I think people do want to be part of the story. They want to understand the story. They want to feel like, oh, these people are like me. These people feel the same way about their animal that I feel about my animal. These people live lives that are like my lives. When you see that, sorry, my dog is barking in the background. When you see that, then you start to be a part of that story. You start to love that story. And honestly, a lot of it's luck.
Yeah.
A lot of it's luck. I mean, I wouldn't say, hey, I'm very proud of Dewey. I think it's a great book, and the response has been great, but I'm not going to say because Dewey is the best-selling cat book that's been written in the last 20 or 30 years, it's the best. We caught a lot of break. We had the right story. I think there's things that are sort of Dewey's story had a lot of great hooks that helped it sell. One was the just incredible story of the way Dewey was found, which is he was dropped into the return book slot at the library on the coldest night of the year, and he was just discovered in there, shivering and cold and almost dead. When you hear that, when people hear that's the way the story starts, they want to know more about that story. So there's that. The fact that it took place in a small town in Iowa turned out to be... the New York Times ran an article about the Dewey book when we sold it, mocking the idea that the book industry was publishing this book. Like a nobody from Iowa, a small town, a cat? Come on. Why does the book industry think that's a book that they should spend their time publishing? Well, that turned out to be why the book was successful, because... you don't hear those stories very much. You don't hear those stories of ordinary people from a small town in Iowa very much. And when we took the book out, the galleys out, independent bookstores in the Midwest, not just Iowa, but where there's like a Midwestern Independent Booksellers Association. They just were like, they loved the book. They supported it so much. You know, those guys were like, we are going to hand sell this book to everybody who comes in here. You know, the Midwestern Independent Booksellers Association single-handedly put that book on the bestseller list.
Yeah. So do you think that this was like a bias, an East or West Coast bias, and this was like a flyover country book, as they call it?
Yes and no, but they were also, we got a $1.25 million advance, which is extraordinarily high. And while it seems now that Dewey was always famous, Dewey wasn't actually really famous at all when we did that book. There had been a lot of articles, but they were like small local interest articles in paper like the Sioux Falls Gazette or whatever. They weren't like, there hadn't been like a USA Today or like a big show on TV or anything like that. So they just took a knee-jerk reaction to it, I think, that, you know, what's the book business doing? Dropping $1 million on some nobody librarian and her cat. You know, there's a lot of nobody librarians. What makes this one special? Well, it made nothing. The book worked because there wasn't really anything that made her special. It was that when people read her story, they said, that's me.
Yeah.
I feel that way. I want to have that life. I want a cat like that. I feel the same way. Mickey went around, and I went around and did a lot of publicity. Every time we did a book event, afterwards, people would come up and say, I just want you to know that I have a cat, and my cat is exactly like Dewey. And then they'd show us a picture, and it would be like a black cat. Or like a cat that looked absolutely physically nothing like Dewey at all. Dewey's an orange cat. They would have a black cat. They'd be like, my cat looks just like Dewey. Well, it wasn't the physical appearance. It was that love. It was that relationship that they were like, this is just like me. It was, it was like, this is my story too, and that's what made it work. And I love that. I didn't even realize it was going to be like that until I wrote Vicky, and now that's why I love to do those books.
Well, you earlier had said that you don't like doing publicity, but you just mentioned you did publicity for Dewey. Was that just the first book thing, and once Dewey took off, you sort of like shy away from the public now?
I don't think people understand. I should clarify what I mean by publicity. If somebody calls me up, they want me to be on their blog, or they want me to come to their house to talk to their book group or to their bookstore, I'm happy to do that. I actually love that. That's a lot of fun. But what you really have to do when you're an author, a lot of authors think, well, I'll do that, and that'll be the publicity. But what you really have to do is get on, contact everybody you know, beg them to have you come in, go out and find a list of people that might seem like they might be vaguely interested in your story. Like with Dewey, I mean, my job as an author would be to contact every cat sanctuary in the state of Georgia and like bug them to read my book. And like, it's really the publicity that's required to be a successful author is sort of perpetually going out and like telling people you don't know, read my book, get back to me. Hey, did you read my book? What's good? And that's the part I hate. That's the part I I don't want to do, and I'd rather connect with somebody who has that personality.
Yeah.
It's a personality thing. I just don't have that personality. I'd rather connect with someone who's going to enjoy that. You know?
So to use an analogy, you prefer being the director behind the scenes and let them be the star in front of the camera.
Yeah, I mean, I love the work.
Yeah.
You know, I just want to do the work. I love the writing. I just want to do the writing. If someone calls me up, wants to ask me about the writing, fantastic. But in terms of being a marketer, I'll have them be the marketer, and they be out there, and they be answering the questions and doing the interviews and posting on Facebook or whatever, doing all that stuff.
Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll talk about some of your upcoming projects, and we'll do that in a moment. Speaking with Bret Witter, BretWitter.com is his website. He's probably best known for the book about Dewey, the Library Cat, and also The Monuments Men, which was made into a fairly successful movie a few years ago about the hunt for the stolen Nazi art treasures. So we've talked about the books that you've done, including those two I just mentioned. Let me just ask you about what is the next project or two that you have in the pipeline? You said you prefer doing the smaller books like Dewey or the Tuesday the Dog book.
I have one book coming out in February 2007. It's called Pure Heart. 2017.
You're a decade behind. You said 2007. You mean 17?
Oh my gosh, 2017. I still can't believe it's 2017.
Yeah.
It's called Pure Heart. It's the first woman to run a legal moonshine distillery in the eastern United States. She's in North Carolina. I took on the book first because her name's Troy. She's very Southern. I loved her, but what I loved about her story was that she has two extremely special needs sons. She spent 25 years taking care of them in the house, working nonstop to be there for her two boys who are both in wheelchairs. They can't talk. They can't lift themselves or anything like that. And she felt like she had always wanted to be an entrepreneur, but she felt like it was too late. That it had passed her by, and she didn't even drink alcohol, but she happened to meet this guy, old mountain guy with this incredibly flamboyant personality. Who had these moonshine connections, and she went up into the mountains and sort of over a 2-year period learned how to make moonshine. So I love her story because it's a story. I think it's very similar in a way to Vicky's story. It's a story about finding your place. It's a story about the unique challenges of being a woman, and how it's always a little bit harder. You're not always dancing backwards in high heels, but there's always time. You know, I hope the audience is out there that reads that book and is inspired to follow their own dream. So that's Pure Heart, a book I love, February 2017. And then the book I'm working on right now is I'm actually flying to Baltimore to spend some time with this guy in about an hour. A guy by the name of Chris Wilson. He grew up, he's African-American. He grew up in a very terrible situation in the inner city in Maryland, but it was really inner city DC. And he ended up murdering somebody when he was 16 years old, got life in prison, turned his life around in prison, did incredible things, learned to speak 3 languages, got a college degree. Most importantly, though, he became a mentor and started helping other people in prison turn their lives around. Helped about 150 people in prison turn their lives around. Ended up getting out of prison 4 years ago after 16 years, and is working now in inner city Baltimore. He runs a business that basically takes, most people call them ex-cons. He hates that term. He calls them returning citizens. People who have been in prison, gives them first jobs so that they can get back on into the workforce. I just love this book. I love Chris. I love the message behind this book that no matter what you do, you can always get a second chance. You know, you're going to have to work for it, and you're going to have people help you, but you can live a powerful, meaningful life. So that's the book I'm working on now, and it's hopefully going to be out in 2018. It should be out. We have the book deal in place. It's scheduled to be out in spring 2018.
Well, let me end this interview by asking you not about your current future project, but you had said that I guess no longer harbor aspirations of being a Faulkner or Dickens or whatnot in terms of being a novelist or a fiction writer. So what would be your dream project, say? Do you have any idea, or is part of like the excitement knowing that at any moment you might get offered a story that comes out of the blue that maybe you had no idea even existed in the world, and
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I like to do, I like the fact that I'm always doing something very different, radically different. I don't feel like I'm niche at all, but honestly, I feel like this is my lifelong project. It's writing books about the ordinary people, like ordinary lives, how we live today, how we really live today. Not how the rich people live or how the people of history are going to point to live, but how ordinary, real people in America live today. I mean, that goes back to the Monuments Men, who were just ordinary people, and how they lived in the 40s, all the way up through someone like Chris, who wasn't even born until the 80s, and is now 38 years old. So I feel like instead of one project, I feel that's my lifelong project, and I want my next project after this to be a story about an ordinary person in America, an ordinary but in their own way extraordinary person in America. That's what I want to do. Yeah. That's all I really want.
So I guess you consider yourself sort of a sociologist, sort of chronicling late 20th century, early 21st century America?
No, that'd be great. I think of myself in a lot of different ways, but I'm not harboring any illusions that anybody's ever going to know who I am, or even that anybody's ever going to be like, I want to read all Bret Witter's books, because together they form a bigger narrative. Yeah. I know that's not going to happen. People who read Dewey never say, oh, I love the way Bret Witter writes, I'm going to read another Bret Witter book. Yeah. It's just not the way it works. Yeah. But for me personally, that's what I feel like I'm doing. And people come to different pieces of it and learn something about the world, and they learn and they understand someone else and their life a little bit better, or they understand their own life and see what word was I looking for? Not importance. See just that, see their own lives in a more positive light. Then that's it.
And the reason technically is that you couldn't use the same kind of approach for Dewey as you did in Monuments Men. So you have to switch the approaches and the way you craft the story for each story individually.
I feel like I'm the writer, so I feel like all my books have, on a strict writing basis, they have a lot of similarities. Yeah. And that someone who was a writer, if they read all my books, would see similarities. That isn't because I'm trying to make them similar. It's because I have idiosyncrasies within my own style. The reason that people don't read Dewey and then Monuments Men and then Until Tuesday is that they never think about me when they read those books. Mm-hmm. They don't. Nobody's like, who's this small name guy? Yeah. The connection is not made. No publisher would ever try to get anybody to read that way. There's no reviewer that ever reviews, hey, this is just like Bret Witter's other book. Yeah. That's not the business. The business is for me to be pushed aside. That's the business model. Mm-hmm. I do the work and I'm pushed aside. And, so you have to accept that as part of this job, and I'm happy to accept that as sort of the price. I don't even think it's a price because I'm doing what I love, but it's the price of being in my position.
Okay, well, Bret Witter is the writer, the author. BretWitter.com is his website. You can find out all about his books, Dewey, Monuments Men, and his other books as well there. I want to thank you for spending an hour or so talking about it, and good luck with your future.
Thank you. It was fun.